Okay, guys, I'm going to talk to you about a kind of complicated subject, fascism and totalitarianism, among other ideologies that we're going to talk about in the period in between World War I and World War II. Really deals with irrational, meaning not rational, not logical, and it's kind of like when society kind of goes crazy. If you want to look at the definition of fascism here, fascism is kind of complicated, but it's a philosophy that exalts the nation. The nation here is a key word, and often race above the individual. There is a autocratic government, meaning usually a dictator's in charge. There is a lot of regimentation, meaning they're going to tell you what you can and can't do, with no opposition. No opposition. All right, and there's a couple other aspects that goes into fascism that we're going to get into, but basically autocratic. Again, a person with unlimited power here. So fascism is not always totalitarianism. We'll talk about totalitarianism, but basically totalitarian has the word total in it. And totalitarian is a government that has absolute control over every aspect of a citizen's life. Every aspect. So you could be fascist. You could be fascist and sort of totalitarian. You could be fascist and totalitarian. Hitler's government was totalitarian and fascist. Stalin's Russia was communist and totalitarian. Mussolini's Italy was fascist with totalitarian tendencies, and Franco's Spain was just fascist, but not totalitarian. So it's complicated, and there's a range, kind of mix of these things as well. Fascism is not a logical ideology. It's inherently crazy. All right, it justifies giving power to one single person, and then demanding total obedience. All right, and it's really emotionally and psychological. But a lot of people will look at fascist Germany and say, like, well, I don't understand. Why do they do it this way? It's complicated, but there's no real you can't explain it like a normal person. So it's irrational. It's like the whole society goes nuts. It's only possible when most people feel deeply insecure. We're talking really about the middle class. If the middle class is insecure, you could get a fascist type society. You need industrialization because fascism relies on propaganda and the military to keep people in line. All right, and really for us here, it's World War I is the catalyst. World War I is the event that afterwards created enough insecurity, especially in Germany, that allowed the fascists to take over. It was so awful, and afterwards it was so rough that people turned to these fascist governments for basically salvation. One leg of fascism is propaganda. They use radios, newspapers, and anything, all right, to explain to people why we're doing the right thing. And they would fascist governments are like bombard the population non-stop with propaganda. I mean, it's like literally a jackhammer in your head 24 hours a day, talking about how wonderful the state is and how great the leader is and how you need to do exactly what they have to say. They would do these big rallies, and they really want to make the individual feel insignificant and make the state seem big. If you've seen any of the Nazi way they do things, everything is huge. As an individual, you feel small. And you need a literate population. You need modern media to get across all these issues. Another leg, other than propaganda, another leg is terror. They frighten people into listening to them. All right? It's terror. You have people, any opposition gets thrown in jail. Any opposition. So you need a big prison system. You need propaganda, and you have half the people believe the propaganda and go along with it. The people that don't believe the propaganda and don't want to go on with it, if they speak out, get thrown in prison. So the people not in prison are either too scared to say anything or believe the propaganda. And then you get the dictator who could do pretty much anything he wants. And it goes after the middle class. Again, the middle class, the people with the most to lose, they are the ones, especially in Nazi Germany, did not want to become communist, and they turn instead to fascism, because fascism will target people's pride in their country, and it'll target their fears. especially like the communists are going to take all of your stuff. You need to listen to us. And people, again, went along with it. So the middle class is key if you're going to have a fascist society. Another kind of the third leg, if there was a tripod, would be nationalism. They're ultra-nationalist. Fascism exploits nationalism. And it's interesting. This is the part that people have a hard time with. There's a mythical component to this. Every nation has its own heritage, its own myths and mythology. And the Nazis took German myths of this Reich, the first German Empire, and they're not really talking about the Kaiser. They're talking about these Teutonic knights that came in the medieval period that existed, but not the way the Nazis did. The Nazis would take these knights, dress people up in armor, and then put swastikas on it to make it seem like they're nationalists, and they wanted people to believe this myth of German nationhood. The mythology component is why every fascist government is a little different. They're all unique to the country. So German fascism is Nazism. Italian fascism was Mussolini. Spanish fascism was what was under Franco. If the United States has a fascist society, we're not going to be just like the Nazis. We would have our own myths with George Washington and the Tea Party. And again, I'm not saying the Tea Party is fascist, but the Tea Party is an example of a group of people that politically feel a certain way, and they looked at America's past, the Boston Tea Party, and are using that for their own goods. Again, I'm not saying the Tea Party is fascist, but that is an example of what fascists would do if they were American fascists. They would look at the American mythology and create their own myths. The Nazis were brilliant at this. They are reactionary. Again, this is what I'm talking about. They recall some national past, which may or may not appeal. The Italians talked about the Roman Empire, all right? And again, Italy, they wanted to bring back the Roman Empire. So they exploit nationalism, and then they throw this past mythology in it to create this new country. And nobody can say, hey, Adolf, I don't remember these Teutonic Knights, because if you challenge them, they just throw you in prison. So again, we'll get into this, kind of how the Nazis existed, but it's a little nuts. Now, if we flip over and talk about totalitarianism, which is a little different than fascism, although you could have a totalitarian fascist government, a lot of the similar characteristics, all right? But again, here is the definition: almost total control over every aspect of your life, all right? Again, not necessarily fascist. You might not necessarily have this nationalism and mythology. Stalinist Russia did not, Stalin did not talk about the Russian past with the czars. He was a communist leader that was also totalitarian. So totalitarian means you basically have total control. So Nazis were fascist totalitarians. All right, that is the biggest classic example. Another modern state that is totalitarian would be North Korea. Italy was fascist, that had totalitarian characteristics, wasn't completely totalitarian. Stalinist Russia was totalitarian, was not fascist. All right, so again, it gets really easy to confuse all these things. You need to realize that totalitarianism is a separate ideology that shares characteristics with fascism, but is not necessarily fascism. There's two distinct things. Fascists rely on symbology, really important. The advanced kids did a whole thing on symbology. This is the fasces. That's the Italian. This is actually the fasces as a symbol here is a Roman symbol that the Roman senators had. There's actually a fasces in the United States Congress because it represents order. And then the Italian fascists took a symbol and perverted it for their own good. The Nazis did the same thing with the swastika here. The swastika, this is actually a reversed swastika on its side. If you look at a swastika, it's a sun symbol of peace. And the Nazis, I think, just liked the look of it and flipped it over and made it look for their own purposes. And this is Franco's fascism. So symbolism is important, and symbology is important for these regimes. So Nazis, idealize and glorify this heritage of these Christian symbols, like the fasces. And if you can always pause and go through this slide, but it kind of explains some of these other symbols that are evident in fascism. Also, another aspect is these people wear military uniforms, but they're not in the military. So if you look at Mussolini here, and you look at Hitler, Hitler's wearing a military uniform. He is not in the military. Mussolini's not in the military. This is the Nazi party uniform. The political party had its own uniform. They would do this to get people to be unified. The brown shirts, which were the SA movement, that's the early days of the Nazi, his followers wore brown shirts. They were actually uniforms left over from World War I, surplus uniforms that they bought and put on their own military style, their own ranking system, and it's paramilitary. It's military-like, but it's not military. It's really weird. So you see these people, especially in the Nazi rallies, in the Nuremberg rallies in the late 20s, early 30s. Hitler's there, and all these guys are there. They're all in military uniforms. They're all in ranks. None of those people are in the military. That is the Nazi Party rally. It's just like if we had the Republicans or the Democratic Party of the United States. They have their own rallies, but it's like if suddenly Obama and the Democrats created a military-style uniform to be a Democrat, and the Republicans created a military uniform to be the Republicans, and you wore those military uniforms to show off your political allegiance. That's what it's like. We don't do that in the United States, but it's one aspect of fascism that's really fascinating with the way these people looked. Fascism, people talk about it all the time. This new labor movement is talking how the English Rose is turning into fascist with these corporations that are publicly owned. So this is somebody that is not against the Labor Party. Also, if you saw the movie V for Vendetta, this is what would fascism look like in the UK in modern times. This is their take on it. It's a really interesting movie. This is the fascist symbol for that government. That is the dictatorial leader. They have a secret police that were there. They have people in military-style uniforms. I mean, really, this was the take on modern fascism. What would it look like? You could ask yourself, if the United States, the government fell, we're no longer a democracy, we became a fascist government, what would it look like? Again, what myths would they do? So V for Vendetta is simply a fascist government, totalitarian fascist government in the UK in modern times. It's a very interesting movie. So hopefully, again, I just provide you just an overview of fascism and totalitarianism. I encourage you to read up. It's a complicated issue, but now at least you have a foundation.